Impacts. In this video, I will be reviewing my two favorite Dewalt impacts, the DCF911 and the DCF900. One is smaller, one is larger. Let's get into it. So for work, I am a mechanic. I use these two tools in addition to many others every single day to fix many cars. I drop them all the time, I work them hard, and in that regard, I hope I can shed some light on when and where you might want each one. Okay, so starting with the DCF911, this is my smaller half-inch drive impact, but I do want to start by highlighting that it is still a half-inch drive impact. You can put all of your normal big sockets on this thing, and kind of the bottom line is it won't necessarily break free every nut ever made that is rusted on there or huge, but it's compact and it's small and it's very convenient. Now, at work, a lot of the time I will start with this guy because it's lighter. Now, when it's all day and you're holding something about here in the middle of your body, taking off lug nuts or something, it's just nicer to have the lighter gun in your hand. And for the most part, I feel like the best way to describe my experience of this thing's kind of break-free capabilities is that it will remove almost all lug nuts up to a truck about. So if you pull in like an F350 and the lug nuts are on averagely tight and they're not rusted, they'll come off with some work. You know, it's not gonna take them off instantly, but they do come off. However, if it pulls in and it's rusted and the previous owner set them all to 300 foot-pounds, this is not gonna do it. So that's kind of my opinion on how powerful it is, but I still grab it first because it's light and small and convenient. So as far as kind of durability goes and how this thing works, I've had it for about 2 years now, and it probably falls off my tool tray at work once to twice every day, you know, from about this high to the floor. And it still works okay. So in that regard, I feel like it's actually built decently. It holds up pretty well. I do tend to use a 4 or 5 amp hour battery on this, and that'll last me approximately 1 to 3 work days, depending on how much I use it. And I do use this one a fair bit, but I wouldn't want to put much smaller battery on here because once the battery does start to get low, you do start to lose some of the power from it. The other thing that comes to mind when using impacts is a lot of the time as a mechanic, I'm combining an impact with potentially a lot of extensions to make something easier. You know, some caliper bracket bolts, you're putting your impact, you know, several feet away from it, even behind axles and stuff, and running it back through, sometimes with, you know, universal joints in that line. And when you start to add a lot of extensions or loose fitting sockets or universal joints onto this gun, it really starts to have trouble breaking certain things free because you have losses in that drivetrain between the driver and the bolt. Okay, this is the DCF900, which at the time I bought it, which was about 2 years ago, this was the top of the line DeWalt driver. At the time of this video, I'm not sure if it still is, to be fair. However, at the time it was their most high output gun you could buy with a battery. And so far it's been pretty great. In terms of power, I guess, to start, it is fairly powerful. You know, normally if my DCF911 won't take it off, this will. And this is great too when you start to combine the impact with more sets of extensions or weird fits, or maybe the socket isn't quite tight on the bolt head, and this thing doesn't care. You know, those losses just don't matter as much when you have way more power behind it, and that's excellent. There has been a few bolts this hasn't taken off for me, and those are usually bolts that you end up having to heat with a torch. So, you know, that's just kind of how that goes. Now, on the trade-off side of things, this thing is quite hefty. You know, if you hold it out fully arm extended like this is a workout. I could probably only do this for like 2 to 3 minutes before I'd have to set it down. And in that regard, it's not as convenient as the smaller driver. You know, it's heavy in your hands, so when you're holding it at awkward angles, it is more difficult. So I kind of reserve it now in my repertoire of tools for when I really need the extra kick in the ass to break something free, as opposed to something I grab every time to do regular tasks. It does have 3 power settings, whereas my other gun does not. And I do like that because I think theoretically this thing puts out something like, I don't know, we're gonna ballpark, it's like 600 to 900 foot-pounds or something. Don't shoot me. But at any rate, in my experience, if you put it on the first power level, it limits output to about 100 foot-pounds. If you put it on the second level, it limits output to maybe like 250. And if you put it on the third level, it's gonna be tight as hell. So I really enjoy kind of the level 1 and 2 because depending on what I'm tightening, I'll know I'm not over tightening it. Like I'll use this to put on lug nuts sometimes. And if you're not trying to over torque a customer's lug nuts, I'll put it on 1 and I know it won't like shear off or be like way too tight. Conversely, if you're doing like Toyota ball joint bolts that are just not supposed to come off, or like a steering gear nut, you know, something that's supposed to be as tight as possible, you put it on 3 and you give it hell, and it gets it where it needs to go, and like way more than you would ever accomplish with a breaker bar and a socket. So kind of some closing comparison thoughts. One thing I haven't touched on yet that I do find kind of important and different in certain tools is their maximum RPM. To kind of illustrate, this big guy here can only do about 2200. And this little one can do up to about 3250 is what it says. You can kind of hear the difference there in speeds. And on certain things, it does make a difference. If you try to take the lock nut on top of a shock off with this, it will just spin the shock body and it won't actually apply those impacts to what you are doing. Whereas this one, it spins fast enough that you're actually getting a lot of leverage out of the kind of resisting inertia of the shock body as you're spinning it up to speed, and you can actually take the lock nut off without having to counterhold the shaft, which is really nice. And then kind of the flip side of that is this one will engage its kind of hammering mechanism that sooner, whereas this one won't because this motor puts out a lot more torque. So for certain things like setting up gears, I'll actually use the big one to spin the pinion for me, and it won't go because it has enough torque to spin it without doing that. Whereas if you try to spin the pinion with this one, it'll just tighten the nut because it starts going into that hammering mode. So here you have it, 2 great tools, both good at different things. There's some slight overlap in what they are good at, but I hope the circumstances in which I laid out as a mechanic that I use them could help you choose well between them. Cheers.